My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/campaign to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
This Steve Jones Show podcast is now loading. The Steve Jones Show podcast is presented by Sunbury Motor Company, Purdue Insurance, Brewers Outlet, and NIL Game Changers. Bringing you an in-depth look at Penn State sports and more. This is the Steve Jones Show on News Radio 1070 WKOK. The Steve Jones Show is presented by Purdue Insurance, Brewers Outlet, and Sunbury Motor Company. Now from the Sunbury Motor Studio, here's Steve Jones.
This half hour being brought to you by the great people at Brewers Outlet, Reagan Street in Sunbury, the beverage supermarket. Imports, domestics, microbrews, the best selection of beer anywhere. Wine coolers, water, soft drinks, lots and lots of snacks. They roast their peanuts fresh and not every day. 6 great flavors of slushies. And the pickle bar, led by my 2 personal favorites, the Barrels and the Dills, indeed second to none. And don't forget, not only stocking up for the weekend for the games, but Thanksgiving's next week. Go to Brewers Outlet, Reagan Street in Sunbury, the beverage supermarket. We bring in the outstanding, and I do mean outstanding, Mark Wogrenrich. Mark, always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, Steve. How are you?
Doing really well. So I want to get to the question you asked, because it's a big picture question, and I understand why James answered it the way he did, and I'm sure you do too. But you asked about, but here's the question. What has a Big Ten schedule, and it doesn't matter which one of the top 4 teams we're talking about here, what does that do to prepare a team should they be in the playoff? Right? And that, obviously, if things continue the way they are, that question will get answered. But in your opinion, based on what you've seen, has the schedule of the teams that they've been playing, I don't mean just Penn State, but Ohio State, Indiana, Oregon, is this Big Ten schedule enough to prepare a team for a playoff, in your opinion?
I think it has been, maybe not as much as it has in the past. And the comparison, and obviously we're going to draw the comparison with the SEC, and that's not what I was trying to goad out of him. But I was trying to ask him that. Because he mentioned it after the game. That was one of the points that he mentioned after the game, that he tied the Big Ten and the SEC. He was basically asked about getting players out of that game, or being able to get starters out, rest them. And I think what he was getting at is you don't get a lot of chances in the Big Ten necessarily to do that. I mean, they played an incredibly good game last week against Washington, which still, it's a pretty good team playing in a completely different conference, which their coach acknowledged, which Ed Fish acknowledged after the game. And to be able to do that, to be able to get a bunch of guys out, I think is a good thing. You kind of expected it at Purdue, especially with the way that game started. I mean, Penn just put it to them quickly and really just gave themselves a great opportunity to play most of that second half. But it hasn't been the case. They have tested. I mean, these teams have tested them, and they've tested themselves through, trips to obviously USC and Wisconsin. Illinois, was tough over stretches. It just seems like they've been able to do that. And if you look at a team like Ohio State, it had its sober moments, like with Nebraska before coming to Beaver Stadium. Obviously, that game was not easy for them. Indiana gets its test this week, so this is going to be the lead, and obviously the argument in 2 weeks about how many each conference gets, whether they're going to get 4. Who could somebody scramble up to 5 if there's chaos? I can't see that. But I don't know necessarily that the SEC's invites are going to be any necessarily better prepared than the Big Ten's invites. Maybe like Alabama obviously is going to have a quality win, that sort of thing. Texas as a champ, Georgia, whether they get in as an invitee. But I think Penn State, Ohio State, Oregon would have a pretty good argument that they've had some square tests just like those teams.
Well, what's interesting is that ESPN will drive the SEC narrative about how great the conference happens to be. And look, I think they're a great conference. But, like, for example, USC beat LSU. It's not, it's not as if, like, they're so shocked Florida beat them. Well, USC beat them too. I mean, so there have been Notre Dame beat Texas A&M at Texas A&M. So it's not as if it's been a perfect season for the SEC, Mark.
Oh yeah, not at all. And they have been eating themselves a little bit. I mean, obviously
sure.
Vanderbilt, a couple of wins. Florida, I think Florida takes LSU pretty much out of contention. The other point is that, and James has made, every Big Ten coach has made this point, if you're going to play 9 conference games, that is going to guarantee you pretty much one better date. Maybe, some of the SEC teams now seem to be scheduling, the marquee out of conference. They're still also playing FCS games, and they're playing them largely in November. And you don't see that from the Big Ten. There's nobody playing this week or last week in the Big Ten playing that sort of game.
Right, and I'll give you an example. Mercer played Alabama this week as one of the games, and
right.
somebody said,
"Who's getting Massachusetts too after a coaching change?"
Georgia, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they've got them, and I'm trying to think. Tennessee's got one too, where you sit back and go, "Okay, really?" In fact, just for the fun of it, let's just take a look at this week's SEC schedule. You've got Georgia, UMass, UTEP against Tennessee, Wofford against South Carolina. Alabama already played Mercer, so that's done. So that so that one's off the rails. Murray State just played Kentucky. Monroe just played Auburn. This is this past week, along with Mercer against Alabama. New Mexico State played Texas A&M. Just remember, Mark, it just means more.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to gauge. I was trying to get more of an eval. I think I probably would have been better phrased, James Franklin, to say, hey, evaluate the Big Ten. Now, what do you think? Because, they're going to go to Minnesota on Saturday, which is, Minnesota's tested them in the past. The history of that game. They had what? I think they won 3 or 4 in a row before losing on the road to Rutgers. So this is not, a Minnesota game should not be considered, just a guarantee game. And I don't think in any way. So that's why I was gauging it. Like, that can be a reasonably good stretch of games that Penn State has played. I don't know the argument about we're all going to argue best win in 2 weeks, but as a compilation of wins, particularly if Penn State wins this week and goes 5-0 on the road this year with a win at West Virginia to start the season too, that's a pretty compelling road schedule, I think, as well.
Well, I think there's something else to it, too. I think there's a series of good teams that Penn State's beaten. In other words, they won at West Virginia. They're a good team. They won at USC, record whatever. Like their games have been so close. They're a good team, actually. Okay, they won at Wisconsin. They're a good team. They beat Illinois. Well, they're a good team. All right. They've got Minnesota. If they were to win that, they're a good team. So they've been getting wins over good teams. All right. And you can only really argue that the only two teams that they've played to this point would be Kent State and Purdue. And that's a small percentage when you're just talking about two games.
Yeah. And that's where I was, again, with the gauging of, getting into the granular about good wins and that sort of thing. You're going to make the argument, like with Texas as well. I think that's probably a fairly common one that people are going to make fairly soon if they run the table and or even if they lose, to Texas A&M, that becomes an issue as well. I don't think the concept of beating, how many great wins can a team have, because the schedule doesn't really allow for that. You don't just play a lot of great teams.
Right.
I think we know that Oregon's a great team. We don't necessarily know that Indiana's a great team. It's having a great season, but we don't know that it's a great team that, it will have a chance to prove that, Saturday against Ohio State, but Penn State's just, that's the way the schedule fell this year. Didn't play that. I think there was a presumption that was, how close was the Penn State USC game to being two top 10 teams at that point in the year? Had USC been able to hold on against Minnesota, that sort of thing too. Right. So I struggle with gauging teams just based on a record, or not just a ranking, rather, because your record says what your record is, but there are pieces of those in there that can say, hey, USC is better than its 5-5 record, and maybe Indiana's not as good as its 10-10 record. We don't necessarily think we know all that yet.
Right. How intriguing, because of the 12-team playoff. Okay, the argument used to be, Mark, that college football had the most meaningful regular season because you only ended up with 2 at the end playing each other, or you had having 4 at the end in a playoff. Do you find this November more intriguing to cover because it's 12 teams as opposed to recent years?
Specifically regarding Penn State, yes, because they still have control of their future. They hadn't before. Outside of like 2016, they were really at the mercy, and even in 2016, for the run of the playoff, they were at the mercy of a committee. But that loss had all but ended it. So the stakes obviously getting higher. The stakes of single games maybe are not as high, but more games. I think we brought so many more games into play that a playoff is affected from noon until 1 a.m. I mean, I went to bed and BYU was playing, and that game wouldn't have mattered largely before. It does now. So I think the fact that we've brought so much more inventory into the mattering category makes it a heck of a lot more entertaining to me.
Okay. When Jack Ham and I did the pregame show for Washington, and I had said in the postgame show for Ohio State, I said, look, after today, Penn State's in a 4-game playoff to make the playoff. Okay. And so I said, Jack, you're the one that lived it. I said, you ended up winning 4 Super Bowls on teams that won 4 Super Bowls. I said, how many of those were undefeated? And he said, none, only the 72 Dolphins. Have fans in college football, or maybe more specifically Penn State fans, started to understand that part of it? Or is the Ohio State thing too much sometimes for some people?
I think in the moment it's too much. It's that week. It's the days before and then the 3 or 4 days afterward. That's an acute point on the body. and for Penn State fans. I got that.
Sure.
I mean, for the week, maybe even another week after that. I think the Washington game served as that cleanse, putting it away. But, I mean, we heard what happened during introductions of the Washington, before the Washington game, that there were smattering of boos that came around. So that was still reaction to Ohio State, and I think they got rid of it after that. There's that understanding. So from what I gather now, from what I see now, I think there's great optimism again about the opportunity to get into the playoff, the even bigger opportunity to host a playoff game. That will subside that residue. That will subsume that residue from the Ohio State game. It just gets so acute in that moment because of that moment and the history. And I think it takes a little while for that to wash away. But I've seen a lot more optimism now about talking to fans and people. Somebody's showing me brackets, like projected brackets and things like that show paths. Now they're believing in paths to the quarterfinals, about trying to dictate who you're going to play when, and then how then who you can play in the second round, that sort of thing. So I think that's taken over a little bit of that, or not a little bit. I think that's taken over most of that, the residue from that Ohio State game.
Sometimes a quarterback can overshadow somebody else on offense is doing really well. And neither one of these guys could care about this. But it feels like Tyler Warren is overshadowing in some ways what Drew has done to this point.
It really does. I was thinking that after the game, is like, how do you overshadow a guy who completed 90% of his passes in a game? And really, one of his two completions is a drop. So Drew, to me, it's phenomenal that he gets I think even James Franklin kind of alluded to this today, that he thinks Drew's underrated, and he said, and I understand why, and the why is Tyler Warren, and Tyler Warren is their 5 tool, but without Drew just being able to manage all the components and the assets that he's got, Tyler, I don't think doesn't have those opportunities, and 2, the other thing is Drew just seems so open to it, and so it goes beyond accepting that Drew is really open and loves being in that sort of offense. Like he does. It's not even that he doesn't mind being sent out to play wide receiver on those 8 snaps a game when Bo and Tyler are taking the quarterback snaps. He seems to revel in it, and just at some point I'm sure he's thinking that play that we practiced where they actually throw to me is going to happen someday. Maybe it'll never will, but he probably even has that in the back of his mind. I think he's just been a revelation this year. The thing that's helped, I think one of the things that's helped Tyler too, and Bo and everybody else in their offense, is the way he can not just run but scramble run. I thought one of the better plays of that game was his 14-yard run that was just kind of escaped the pocket, and he broke a low tackle and a high tackle attempt on the same play. And there's 2 guys going at him in different ways, and he breaks both of them and gets a first down. And that was just, if you watch Drew Allar all year, you've seen hints of that sort of thing. He put everything together on that run. But I think if you haven't watched him, that would have surprised people. And if, whoever's scouting him for the future, looking at that has to make you say, how? How do we keep this guy from hurting us? How do we keep the other guy, obviously, but then he can do it too. So you're right. It's just fascinating. His season with a 70% completion percentage and everything else he's done, and he's not the most popular player in his offense.
By the way, the Big Ten Offensive Player of the Week just announced Tyler Warren. So,
of course.
Of course he was.
190 all-purpose yards.
Yeah. Well, this is a team that they're facing this week that has 20 takeaways on the year. And I know that was addressed in the press conference, but that's how opportunistic they have been to this point. In your experience of watching teams, when you're facing a team that has a reputation for being opportunistic, what has been the common approach to attacking a team like that?
Don't give him opportunities. And if you want a quarterback who doesn't give teams opportunities, I mean, I present you Drew Allar.
Yeah.
That was, the 25-2 number of last year, I think got interpreted a lot of different ways. But this year, he has been opportunistic when he needs to be, but he just hasn't given teams too many opportunities to to really turn him out. I think he's probably got a handful of balls that he would want back, and not many of them are even necessarily interceptions. They're going to have maybe a couple, but I mean, just the last one against Ohio State, just I found that just to be a phenomenal play.
It's just a great play. Yep.
By their corner against Trey Wallace. Wallace beats him the play before. The corner beats him in the end zone. That I don't know that there's. Even Drew said I could put the ball in a better place, but there's not a ton more that he could have done on that kind of coverage. And that's the thing to me, that he just doesn't. I would like him to look maybe downfield a little more. I was surprised they didn't hit. Or at least maybe take some of those attempts against Purdue, just trying to, free him up a little bit. But he didn't, because I think when he sees stuff isn't there, I never felt like he's been that force kind of quarterback. But this year I feel like he's throwing receivers or pass catchers open a little bit more, but he's also never been the quarterback who is going to just force a situation. Maybe there's times he has to, but again, with a team with 16 interceptions, and which leads Big Ten in turnover margin, I don't think you want to give them any opportunities to get its crowd going, flip a script with its offense, and turn turn over a big play kind of thing, and your 7-0 lead is now tied, or it goes from 3-0 to 10-0, things like that. You don't want to. I don't think you necessarily want to give them that opportunity.
No. You'd be playing with
I think he's a quarterback who can manage those situations really well and not give away opportunities.
Mark, a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Me too. Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it.
Back with more in a moment on News Radio 1070 WKOK.
Sunbury Motors Hyundai is going to make this a November to remember. Sunbury Motors Hyundai received 10 truckloads of new Hyundais, and we need to make room now. Choose from over 55 brand new Hyundai Tucsons with savings over $6,500. Sunbury Motors has the full-size SUV Hyundai Santa Fe discounted up to an unbelievable $6,197 off. Both the Tucson and Santa Fe have financing as low as 0% for 48 months and 1.99% for 60 months. Remember, all new Hyundais come with America's best warranty, 10 years, 100,000-mile powertrain. If you want to have a fun day, why not buy a Santa Cruz Hyundai? This nimble pickup starts at $31,340. The Santa Cruz is discounted up to $49,50 with 23 available. Sunbury Motors in the North 4th Street Auto Plaza is going to save you the most money all year now. 10 truckloads of new Hyundais will make this month a November to remember with your next Hyundai from Sunbury Motors Hyundai.